Millionaire saves 5 babies from danger, not knowing they are his own children, with ex-wife. The city lights of New York stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls of Elliot Moore's penthouse office. The skyline, with its towering monuments to wealth and success, seemed to be the perfect reflection of the man himself. He was a self-made millionaire at the age of 38, an entrepreneur whose name carried weight in every boardroom he entered, every deal he closed. But behind that glass, the view was more than just a view of the city. It was a fortress, the same fortress Elliot had built around his heart over the years. It had been a long day of meetings, calls, and strategy sessions. The pace was relentless. Elliot thrived on it. For him, the world moved at a pace that no one could keep up with, and that was exactly how he liked it. He had risen from the rough, uncertain streets of Brooklyn with nothing but ambition and an ironclad will to succeed. He didn't know his biological father, but he was raised by Victor Moore, the man who owned Moore Industries, one of the largest tech conglomerates in the country. Victor had never been a warm man. He didn't need to be. He was a titan, and Elliot had been trained to follow his every command, to succeed, to take risks, to conquer. But it wasn't just his father's empire that Elliot had inherited. It was the unrelenting pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, to never let down his guard. It was a pressure that shaped him into the man he had become. The same man who couldn't remember the last time he sat down for dinner with friends or family, let alone opened his heart to someone. It was late, nearly midnight. Elliot's eyes were focused on his laptop screen, reviewing the final numbers for his latest acquisition. His finger hovered over the keyboard, about to confirm the deal. It was exactly the kind of victory he was used to, a smart, calculated move that would add another zero to his bank account. But just as his finger was about to press enter, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Carla Matthews, his assistant. She was always punctual, professional, and most importantly, capable of cutting through the noise when she needed to. But tonight, there was something in her eyes that made Elliot pause. "Sir, there's something you need to know," Carla said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I've just received a call from an anonymous source. It's about a group of children being held hostage. The authorities are involved, but they're at a standstill. The situation is getting worse and we might need to step in." Elliot raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Children? What do you mean? Why are you bringing this to me now?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. He didn't do rescues, he made deals, he didn't play the hero. Carla bit her lip, looking down at the floor for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "The children are being held by a gang involved in human trafficking. I know it's not your usual thing, but the authorities are out of leads, and the children are running out of time. The source said that they need someone with the resources and power to get them out. Someone like you." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. The moment felt surreal. He was used to handling high-stakes situations, mergers, hostile takeovers, negotiations that could make or break careers, but this was something else entirely. Children, innocent children. For a brief moment, Elliot felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of something human, something raw. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice flat, but the unease in his chest was unmistakable. He wasn't sure what made him hesitate. Maybe it was the desperation in Carla's eyes, or perhaps it was the growing sense that just for once he needed to do something that didn't involve a paycheck. But before he could fully process what was happening, Carla continued, her voice more urgent now. "I know this isn't your world, Elliot, but you're the only one who can do this. I know you don't believe in family or saving people, but think of it as a business deal. You know how to get things done. This is just another problem to solve. And if you do this, it could make a world of difference for these kids. You don't have to get involved emotionally. Just do what you do best. Use your resources." Elliot was silent for a long time. He stared out at the lights of the city, his mind racing. This wasn't his world. It wasn't a deal that could be measured in profit margins or return on investment. But as the weight of Carla's words sank in, he felt something deep inside him stir, a feeling he hadn't felt in years, and one he couldn't quite place. "Get me all the information you can. I'll make some calls," he said, finally breaking his silence. Carla nodded, relief washing over her face. "I'll get right on it." As Carla left, Elliot stood up from his desk and walked over to the large window that overlooked the skyline. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. A man who had everything. A man who had nothing. A man who could have anything he wanted in the world, but had nothing that truly mattered. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the thoughts that had begun to cloud his mind. He didn't do things for free. He didn't do things for charity. But something about the idea of those children, trapped and helpless, made him feel as though he was standing at a crossroads. What if this was the moment that could change everything? What if saving them could, in some strange way, save him too? The next morning, Elliot's private jet was on its way to the outskirts of the city. The mission had been set in motion, and he was determined to see it through. Carla had arranged everything, and his team was in place. But as he settled into the plush leather seats of his jet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than he had imagined. He had always been good at controlling situations, but this was different. He was about to rescue 5 children from a gang, and in doing so, he would learn more about himself than he could have ever anticipated. But little did Elliot know, the rescue mission was only the beginning of a journey that would unravel the deepest layers of his heart. And the 5 children he was about to save. They were about to turn his world upside down in ways he could never have imagined. The jet soared above the clouds, cutting through the sky like a blade. Below, New York City sprawled beneath the horizon, a world of ambition, power, and the relentless pursuit of success. And for Elliot Moore, it was a world he was about to leave behind, if only for a moment, to rescue 5 innocent lives. Little did he know, the children he was about to save were more connected to him than he could ever have dreamed. And that was the first twist of a story that would change his life forever. The private jet cruised through the skies, the city of New York shrinking beneath them. Elliot Moore sat in the plush seat, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest, his mind a tangled web of thoughts and calculations. The reality of the situation hadn't quite settled in yet. The gravity of rescuing children from a human trafficking ring felt almost surreal in his world, a world that had always been so clean, so controlled, so predictable. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds break apart as the plane descended. For a moment, his thoughts drifted back to the childhood he rarely thought about. The absence of warmth in his father's mansion, the weight of expectations that crushed him. Victor Moore had always taught him that emotions were a liability, that everything in life could be handled through ambition and control. Feelings were a weakness. They made you vulnerable. But now, as the ground below him came into sharper focus, Elliot found himself unsettled by the very thing he'd been taught to suppress. He hadn't prepared for this. There was no blueprint for rescuing children, no guide for what to do next. His hands clenched involuntarily as the realization hit him. He didn't know how to help these children. He didn't even know if he could. The plane landed smoothly on a private airstrip, far from the reach of the city's hustle and bustle. A sleek black SUV awaited him, its engine idling, the doors open as his security team greeted him with their usual efficient silence. Carla Matthews was already standing by the vehicle, her face set in a determined expression. She'd arranged everything, every detail meticulously planned. But even in her calm demeanor, there was a flicker of something unspoken. "Everything's in place," she said as he stepped out of the jet. "We'll meet the contact in 10 minutes. They'll brief you on the location." Elliot nodded, his mouth dry. He didn't ask questions. There was no room for doubt now. This was happening. The children were out there, waiting to be saved, and he was their only hope. The drive to the location was long, the roads winding through dense woods and farmlands, far from the city's bright lights. Elliot sat in silence, staring out the window, his thoughts still a blur. Carla, in the front seat, had made a few calls, coordinating the logistics, but no one spoke a word. The quiet of the vehicle seemed to stretch the distance even further, each mile a reminder of how far out of his comfort zone Elliot had ventured. The mansion came into view as they rounded a bend in the road. It looked like something out of a movie, a decaying old estate, hidden behind tall iron gates, the sprawling grounds surrounding it shrouded in shadows. The mansion, a once grand structure, was now little more than a decaying husk of its former self. Windows were boarded up, and the surrounding fences were high, jagged, and intimidating. It screamed danger. The SUV came to a stop in front of the gates, where a man in a worn jacket stood waiting. He looked out of place, unkempt and scruffy, his face a mixture of anxiety and resolve. He was the contact. Carla gave him a brief nod, and the man quickly approached the vehicle. "This way," he said in a low voice, almost whispering. There was a sense of urgency to his tone, but it was mixed with a quiet terror that made Elliot's stomach tighten. "They're inside, but we've got to be quick." Elliot didn't need further prompting. He followed the man, his footsteps heavy on the gravel as the gates creaked open. The air was thick with tension, and Elliot felt the weight of every moment pressing down on him as they walked through the overgrown yard. It felt like time was slowing, dragging him deeper into a world he had never wanted to be a part of. They approached the front door, and the man quickly knocked 3 times in quick succession, a prearranged signal. After a moment of silence, the door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit hallway. A woman in her late 20s, pale and tired, greeted them. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes wide and darting with fear. "The children are in the back room," she said, her voice barely audible. "Hurry." Elliot nodded, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what to expect inside, but he was determined to find the kids and get them to safety. As they moved down the narrow hallway, the floorboards creaked underfoot, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and the woman pushed it open gently. The sight that greeted Elliot made his heart seize in his chest. 5 children, all under the age of 5, were sitting on the floor in a small, dimly lit room. They were dirty, hungry, and terrified. But it wasn't just their condition that rattled him. It was their faces. There was something so eerily familiar about them, something that made him pause. The children looked up at him, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Elliot stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. For reasons he couldn't explain, a shiver ran down his spine. They didn't look like strangers. They looked like they belonged to him. The woman quickly ushered them to their feet, and Elliot snapped out of his daze, his focus returning to the task at hand. He crouched down in front of the children, trying to offer them some comfort, though he didn't know how. He wasn't used to this, being around children, let alone comforting them. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" he said gently, his voice low. The words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of their trauma, but it was all he had to offer. Carla stepped forward, holding out a bag of snacks. The children hesitated for a moment before reaching for them, their small hands trembling. Elliot watched as they devoured the food, their faces lighting up as they ate, their eyes beginning to soften, even if only for a brief moment. As Elliot stood preparing to leave, a voice from behind startled him. One of the children, a little girl with curly hair and a wide-eyed expression, spoke softly but clearly. "Are you our daddy?" The words hit Elliot like a freight train. The question hung in the air, impossible to ignore. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned to look at the girl, confusion and disbelief flooding him. "Daddy," he repeated, almost choking on the word. The little girl nodded, her face full of innocence and hope. "Are you our daddy?" Elliot's mind raced, but before he could process what was happening, the man who had brought them here spoke again, his voice tense. "You need to go now. They'll be back soon." Elliot snapped into action, pushing aside the strange feeling that had overtaken him. He motioned for Carla and the others to move quickly, and they ushered the children out of the room. But as they made their way back down the hall, his mind couldn't shake the girl's words. Could they be his children? It seemed impossible. He had no memory of ever fathering a child, let alone 5. But the thought gnawed at him. The resemblance was undeniable. The more he looked at the children, the more it felt like he was staring into a mirror of his own past, a reflection of something he had long buried. As they made their way out of the mansion, Elliot couldn't shake the question that lingered in his mind. Who were these children, and what did their question mean for him? The night was far from over, and the answers he was searching for would change everything. The SUV sped away from the mansion, the children safely in tow, but the questions remained, unanswered, lingering, and waiting to be confronted. The car ride back to the city felt interminable. Elliot sat in the back seat of the black SUV, the weight of the night pressing down on him like an unrelenting storm. The children, now wrapped in blankets, sat quietly in the seats across from him. They were exhausted, confused, and still so wary of the world around them. The calm silence was almost eerie, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle from the back seat as the children shifted, still processing their change in circumstances. Elliot had never been around children for long stretches. He'd never needed to be. His life had been consumed by work, by the pursuit of success. Children were a distraction, something his father had made clear from a young age. Emotions, relationships, connections, they were all liabilities. But now, sitting in the back seat of a car with these 5 small souls, he felt like a stranger in his own world, a world he'd built from the ground up, yet had never really lived in. His thoughts drifted back to the moment when the little girl had called him Daddy. He had dismissed it at first, thinking it was some simple mistake, a misunderstanding from a child who had been through too much trauma. But the way she had looked at him with those wide, innocent eyes had shaken him to his core. Something in her face, in the way she spoke, felt all too familiar. Elliot glanced out the window, the city skyline now approaching. His thoughts were a tangled mess. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear: these children were no accident. There was something deeper at play, something that tied him to them in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The SUV pulled up to a quiet, discreet mansion on the outskirts of the city. The mansion had been secured by Elliot's team as a safe haven for the children, far away from any immediate threats. It was a place where they could rest and regroup before the next steps were taken. As the car doors opened, Elliot felt a sense of discomfort wash over him. He was stepping into territory that felt completely alien to him. He had handled multi-million-dollar mergers, had negotiated deals that had shifted the balance of power in industries, but this was different. He wasn't a father. Not yet, anyway. But with each passing moment, the uncertainty about what to do next gnawed at him. He wasn't sure if he had the right instincts for this. He didn't know how to comfort them, how to help them feel safe. What did he even say to a child who had been through so much? The children slowly stepped out of the car, still clinging to their blankets as if the world around them might disappear at any moment. Carla, ever efficient, led them into the house, giving Elliot a moment to breathe. "Do you want to meet with Emma now?" Carla asked quietly as she stood beside him. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle concern in her eyes. She had been with him through countless business ventures, but this was something entirely different. She could see the confusion, the unease that had taken hold of him. Elliot nodded, though he didn't feel ready for whatever was coming next. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, almost suffocating, but there was no turning back now. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was warmer than the cold exterior suggested. The staff had been briefed and were already preparing the rooms for the children, setting up everything they might need: beds, toys, and food. There was an air of urgency, but also of careful consideration. Everything was about providing comfort and safety for these children who had seen too much of the world's darkness. And then there was Emma Woods, a woman Elliot had never met, but who, in this strange new reality, felt like a lifeline. Carla had spoken highly of her, a social worker with a calm demeanor, an empathetic soul who could connect with children in ways most people couldn't. Emma had already arranged for the children's care, and now she stood at the center of the room, her presence grounding the chaos. She was in her late 20s, with soft brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her features were kind but intense, as though she carried a quiet weight of her own. She moved with a sense of purpose, a focus that made her seem completely in control, even in the face of uncertainty. Elliot stood awkwardly in the corner, watching her as she spoke gently to one of the children, a small boy with wide, tear-streaked cheeks. She knelt in front of him, her voice soothing, her hands warm as she offered him a cup of juice. She had a way with them that Elliot couldn't quite place. It was more than just professionalism, it was a connection, a deep well of compassion that he hadn't experienced before. She looked up at him, catching his gaze for the first time since he had entered the room. There was no judgment in her eyes, no surprise at his presence. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting him all along. "Mr. Moore," she said, her voice soft but steady, "we've got everything set up for them. I've arranged for a full evaluation and the care they'll need moving forward. They're safe here, but we need to talk about what comes next." Elliot was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to speak with such confidence, such assurance. But her calmness wasn't just professional, it was deeply rooted in something more, a certainty that he didn't have. "Next," he repeated, his voice sounding foreign even to him. "I don't know what comes next. I don't know what to do here. I didn't sign up for this." Emma stood up, her eyes not leaving his. "You're doing more than you realize, Mr. Moore," she said. "It's okay not to have all the answers right now, but what matters is that you're here. And that's more than most people would do." Elliot stared at her for a moment, feeling the weight of her words settle into him like an anchor. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel so small in this moment. He had been a man who could command a boardroom, who could dictate terms, who could control outcomes. But here, with these children, with Emma's quiet strength, he felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain of what was to come. As the minutes passed, the children began to settle into the rooms, their exhaustion taking over. Emma was already speaking with the house staff, arranging for everything to be as comfortable as possible. But Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers, something that he couldn't quite grasp. "What happens to them now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was asking about the children or about himself. Emma looked at him again, her eyes softer now but still filled with purpose. "They need stability, they need love, and they need a place to heal. But you, Mr. Moore, you're going to have to decide what role you're going to play in their lives." Elliot blinked, her words sinking in with a weight that felt like it might crush him. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't know if he could do this. But he also realized with a strange clarity that he might not have a choice. These children had already become a part of him, whether he was ready or not. For the first time in years, Elliot felt something stir within him, something deep and primal. It wasn't about business, it wasn't about success, it was about connection. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt the pull of something greater than himself. Emma turned back to the children, her back to him now, her focus unwavering. But as Elliot watched her, he realized something that sent a chill through his veins. She was right. This was just the beginning, and he wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. But there was one thing he knew for sure. This was a journey that would change him, and these children, forever. The days that followed the rescue felt like a blur to Elliot. His life, once so meticulously planned and orderly, had shifted into something unrecognizable. Every decision, every move he made seemed to ripple outward in ways he couldn't anticipate. The children, 5 small souls who had come into his life unexpectedly, now occupied a space in his heart he hadn't known was there. Elliot woke up every morning with the feeling of heavy responsibility weighing down on him. He had been in control of so many things, but this was different. His penthouse, the sleek, modern apartment that had always felt like a symbol of his success, now felt distant, empty, and cold. He had spent so much of his life building this empire, this fortress of wealth and status, but it was clear now that none of it meant anything without a true sense of connection. The mansion, where the children were staying, had been transformed into a place of temporary refuge. Carla, with her usual efficiency, had made sure everything was arranged: security, privacy, medical care and counseling for the children, though Emma Woods remained the focal point of their emotional care. She had become an anchor for the children in a way that felt natural. Elliot admired her quiet strength, even as he struggled to understand the depths of his own feelings. As for him, he was struggling to adapt to this new role, a role he hadn't signed up for: father. He didn't know what that meant. But something about these children, about their trust in him, made it impossible to turn away. He had to stay. He couldn't walk away from this. They needed him, even if he didn't know how to give them what they needed. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Elliot found himself sitting alone in the grand yet sterile living room of the mansion. His mind churned with questions. What was he supposed to do now? What kind of man was he if he could abandon everything he knew to take on the responsibility of 5 kids? He had always prided himself on being a man of calculated decisions, but there was no formula for this. The stillness of the room was interrupted when Emma appeared in the doorway. She looked tired but resolute, her eyes reflecting a quiet determination that both reassured and unsettled him. She had become a constant presence in his life, and despite his best efforts to keep his distance, Elliot couldn't help but notice the way her empathy seemed to extend not just to the children, but to him as well. "Mr. Moore," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "We need to talk." Elliot nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the glass of scotch he had been absent-mindedly swirling. He had known this conversation was coming, though he hadn't been prepared for it. He had no idea how to navigate this. "About what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the tension in his chest. "The children," she began, stepping further into the room. "I've been in contact with their social workers and we've had some developments. I know this may be difficult for you to hear, but I need you to be prepared. There's something about them, about their background, that I think you should know." Elliot's heart raced. His throat tightened as he swallowed hard. He had already assumed these children weren't just victims in this story. They were tied to something bigger, something he hadn't yet fully grasped. But hearing the words out loud, that was something else entirely. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low and filled with an edge of uncertainty. Emma hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "There's a possibility that the children are your biological children, all 5 of them." The words hung in the air like an impossible riddle, and Elliot froze. The world around him seemed to stop moving. He couldn't breathe. The glass in his hand trembled, the contents swaying with the movement of his shaking fingers. His mind raced. "What?" he whispered, the word coming out as a strangled breath. "That's impossible. I've never even seen them before." Emma nodded, her expression solemn. "I know, but there's evidence now. DNA tests. The children were all born around the same time, from different mothers, and there's a distinct genetic link between them and you." Elliot's mind whirled, but it was as if his thoughts couldn't quite catch up with the weight of her words. 5 children, all his. He had always been careful, detached, distant from any relationship that could lead to this kind of responsibility. He had never wanted children, he had never even considered it. But now, as he sat there, the cold, calculated businessman who had spent years in the high-stakes world of mergers and acquisitions found himself unable to make sense of what was happening. Emma sat down across from him, her gaze softening as she watched him process the information. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said gently, "but these children, they've already started to form a bond with you. Whether you're ready or not, they've already begun to see you as their father." Elliot's chest tightened at her words. He closed his eyes, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. A father. He had never been a father. He hadn't even thought about being one. His own father, Victor Moore, had been emotionally distant, a man who believed that success was the only thing that mattered. Elliot had grown up thinking the same way, but now everything was different. His whole world had been turned upside down in a matter of days. A silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Elliot didn't know what to say. His mind was still reeling, trying to make sense of the impossible truth. These children were his, and somehow he had already failed them. He had failed to be there when they needed him most, and now, in their time of crisis, he was trying to figure out how to step into a role that felt alien to him. "I can't do this alone," he finally said, his voice cracking with the weight of the admission. "I don't know how to be their father. I don't even know where to start." Emma looked at him with a tenderness that almost felt like pity, though her eyes remained filled with compassion. "You're not alone," she said softly. "You don't have to figure it all out right away. These kids don't need perfection. They need you to show up, to be there for them. You don't need all the answers. You just need to be present." The simplicity of her words struck Elliot like a blow to the chest. He had spent his entire life believing that he had to have everything figured out, that every step needed to be calculated, that he had to control every outcome. But here, in this moment, he realized that control wasn't what these children needed. What they needed, what he needed, was to step into the unknown, to embrace uncertainty. The quiet in the room deepened. Elliot felt something inside him begin to shift, a slow, reluctant acceptance of the truth. He wasn't sure how he would do this, or even if he was capable of doing it, but he knew one thing for certain now: he couldn't walk away. These children, his children, needed him, and for the first time in his life he was ready to step up, even if he didn't know what the road ahead would look like. The night stretched on, but for Elliot, the weight of the revelation didn't lift. Instead, it settled deeper, rooting itself into his soul. He had a new purpose now, one he had never asked for. But in the face of this new reality, he couldn't help but feel something he hadn't in years: hope. The days after the revelation blurred together in a haze of meetings, quiet moments, and unexpected realizations. Elliot had always been the kind of man who thrived on control. In business, in his life, in everything he touched, he knew the moves before anyone else could make them. But now, sitting in the midst of this chaos, 5 children who were inexplicably his own, he found himself standing in uncharted waters, unsure of which direction to swim. The mansion had become his new home, but it still felt like an alien landscape. The sterile, modern space he had crafted for himself in the heart of the city now seemed inadequate, even cold. Here, in this sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, he had given up the life of solitude that had defined him for so long. But still, something gnawed at him. How was he supposed to be their father? What did that even mean? Each morning he woke to the soft sounds of children laughing and playing in the distance. The walls of the mansion, once silent and imposing, now reverberated with the innocent sounds of life. It was jarring at first, the contrast between the silence of his former life and the energy that now filled the house. He didn't know how to navigate it, how to be part of it. Emma, who had become an unspoken guide in this new world, moved through the space with a quiet grace. She had already established a rhythm with the children, the quiet hum of affection that radiated from her every action. She made it look effortless, but Elliot knew it wasn't. He could see the weight in her eyes when she wasn't looking at him. She was carrying something too, something that tethered her to the children, to their brokenness. He admired her for it, but also resented her just a little. She had figured this out before he had. One afternoon, after another day spent trying to keep up with the logistics of caring for 5 children, not to mention dealing with his own growing inner turmoil, Elliot found himself alone in the garden. It was the one place in the mansion where he could escape the noise of his thoughts and the weight of his new responsibilities. The air was crisp, and the garden, while slightly overgrown, was beautiful. He wandered along the path, trying to push aside the mounting pressure that came with being thrust into a role he never sought, never wanted. As he stood there looking out over the garden's wild beauty, he felt an unexpected sense of something approaching clarity. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and seeing the full scope of the land beneath, vast and unknown, but full of possibility. Could he really do this? Could he truly become the father these children needed? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft patter of footsteps. He turned to see Emma approaching, her expression unreadable but somehow warm, the way she always seemed to be. She had that uncanny ability to approach people without judgment, to let them feel seen and understood. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice light but with a hint of concern. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the garden, letting his gaze sweep over the untamed beauty of the space. "I'm not sure how to do this," he finally said, his voice rough with a vulnerability he wasn't used to showing. "I thought I could handle anything. But this is different." Emma moved closer, standing by his side. "It's okay to feel like that," she said, her voice gentle. "You're doing better than you think." Elliot gave a small, humorless laugh. "Better than I think? I'm barely holding it together. These kids, they deserve so much more than what I can give them. I'm not even sure where to begin." Emma looked at him, her gaze softening, understanding the depth of his struggle. "You don't have to be perfect," she said quietly. "They don't need perfection. They need you. And they need you to be real with them. You're already showing up. That's the most important thing." Elliot felt the sting of her words. He wasn't used to showing up for anyone, let alone children he didn't know, children who, in their own ways, were broken by the world. But the truth of her words settled in his chest, a soft truth that wasn't easy to swallow, but was undeniably real. "I'm trying," he whispered, his voice catching, "but I don't know if I'm enough." "You are," Emma said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. "They see you, they trust you, and that's the first step. You just have to keep showing up, every day, for them, for yourself." Elliot stood still for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in, wrapping around him like a blanket. Could it really be that simple? Could he truly just be there? He had always believed that everything in life had to be earned, that success was a matter of grit and sacrifice. But here, in this space, the rules seemed to be different. The children didn't need him to be a genius businessman, a corporate titan. They needed him to be present, to be real. He closed his eyes for a moment, the quiet of the garden wrapping around him. For the first time, he allowed himself to take in the enormity of the change happening in his life. His ambition, his obsession with building an empire, had driven him for so long, but now, standing in this garden, surrounded by the soft sounds of children's laughter and the reassuring presence of Emma, he felt something shift. Over the next few days, Elliot made a conscious effort to spend more time with the children. It wasn't easy. He didn't know what to say to them, how to connect with them in a way that felt genuine. But he tried. He took them to the park, played games, and helped with the small things that seemed to make a world of difference for them. Slowly, he began to notice the small changes in them, the way they would look up at him when he entered the room, the way they began to trust him more. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't a grand transformation, but it was real, and it mattered. One evening, after tucking the children into bed, Elliot sat on the couch, his body exhausted in a way it had never been before. His life had always been about working harder, pushing himself further. But this was something else entirely. It was about patience. It was about presence. It was about showing up in a way he never had before. Emma came in quietly, sitting down beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between them now, a shared space where words weren't required. Finally, Elliot broke the silence. "I'm starting to get it," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm starting to see what they need from me." Emma turned to him, her eyes soft but full of quiet pride. "It's not about perfection, it's about being there. And you're doing that. You're doing more than you think." Elliot nodded, feeling something shift inside him, something he couldn't yet put into words. It was a feeling of growth, of change, of understanding. This journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt like he might be on the right path. As the days passed, Elliot began to understand that he wasn't just learning to be a father to these children. He was learning to be a better version of himself, a version that wasn't defined by his success or his wealth, but by his ability to love and to show up for others. It was a humbling experience, one that would change him forever. And for the first time in his life, Elliot Moore didn't need to be the smartest person in the room. He didn't need to have all the answers. What he needed, what he was beginning to understand, was how to be vulnerable, how to connect, and how, just maybe, to love. The man who had spent his entire life building walls around himself was learning to let them fall, one small moment at a time. The mansion had settled into a quiet rhythm, but it wasn't the kind of calm that Elliot had expected. He had spent his whole life moving in and out of high-pressure environments, where silence was a rare commodity and activity never stopped. Now, with the children under his roof, silence wasn't an absence of noise. It was a layer of tension that hovered just beneath the surface. The constant hum of life in the mansion had taken on a different meaning, one he hadn't anticipated when he first agreed to take them in. He was learning to live with the noise, the laughter, and the occasional chaos that came with raising 5 young children. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in his life, he didn't mind it. But even as he adjusted to this new way of life, Elliot couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the horizon. His instincts, the ones he had honed over years of navigating corporate boardrooms and ruthless business deals, told him that the calm they were experiencing was temporary. There was something in the air, an unease that he couldn't quite shake. It was late one evening when his suspicions were confirmed. Elliot had just finished a long day of meetings, the weight of his business responsibilities still lingering in his mind. He had barely settled into the quiet of his office when his phone rang, the sharp tone cutting through the stillness. Carla's name flashed on the screen. "Mr. Moore, we need to talk." Carla's voice came through, sharp with urgency. "We've got a situation." Elliot's pulse quickened. He knew that tone. It was the tone she only used when things were about to go sideways. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "There's been a breach in security," Carla said quickly. "A group of men, the ones we suspect were part of the trafficking ring, are here. They've been watching the mansion for days. They know about the children. They're planning something." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. The children. His children. He hadn't even considered the possibility that the danger might still be out there, lurking just beyond the security of the mansion's walls. His thoughts immediately turned to the children, who were safely in their rooms at that moment, unaware of the threat looming outside. "Are they inside?" he asked, his voice low. "No," Carla responded. "Not yet. But they're getting close. I'm bringing in extra security, but you need to be prepared. They're dangerous." Elliot stood up from his desk, his mind racing. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Have everything ready." The drive to the mansion felt like it took hours. The streetlights blurred past in a rush, but Elliot's focus was singular, the children. He needed to get to them. They were the only thing that mattered now. As the car pulled up to the gates, the imposing mansion loomed in front of him, dark and silent in the night. The security team was already in place, their faces grim as they checked every corner of the estate, every shadow. The tension was palpable. The air felt heavy with something unsaid, something that hovered in the background, waiting to be set free. Carla was waiting for him at the front door, her expression tight with concern. She didn't say a word as he approached, simply led him inside where the children were playing quietly in the living room. The sight of them, so innocent and unaware, struck Elliot deeply. They were his responsibility now, and as much as he wished he could shield them from the world's darkness, he knew he couldn't. "Not anymore. Everything's secure for now," Carla said in a low voice, her eyes scanning the room. "But we need to get them out of here, to a safe location. We don't know when they're going to strike." Elliot nodded, the urgency of the situation settling over him. He couldn't risk waiting. They had to move quickly before the threat grew too close. But as he looked at the children, something in his chest tightened. How could he explain this to them? How could he make them understand what was happening? It didn't matter. He couldn't let them see the fear that had begun to creep into his own heart. He had to be strong for them. "Carla, get everything ready." "We leave in 15 minutes, Elliot said, his voice sharp with authority. As the minutes ticked by, the mansion's usual calm was replaced with a heightened sense of alert. The children, still oblivious to the threat, played games and listened to music, their laughter ringing through the house. Emma was with them, her calm presence offering some semblance of peace in the chaos. Elliot watched her for a moment, wondering how she managed to keep her composure. She had been through this before, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just some nameless child in need of rescue. This time the children were his. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the security team had everything in place. The plan was simple: move the children to the safest place they could find until the threat was neutralized. But as they were about to leave, the lights in the mansion flickered, followed by the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving in the distance. Elliot's heart skipped. He knew what that sound meant. They were coming. The gang had made their move. "We have to go now," Carla said, her voice sharp with urgency. "There's no time to waste." Elliot didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, his mind already calculating the best route to get them to safety. Emma was already by his side, guiding the children through the back door and out to the waiting cars. The tension was thick in the air, every movement feeling like it might set off an explosion. But they moved swiftly, each step a desperate bid for safety. As they reached the cars, Elliot glanced back at the mansion, his heart heavy. This place, the place he had hoped would be their sanctuary, was no longer safe. It was no longer just a building, it was a battleground. The cars sped away, leaving the mansion behind. The night felt suffocating as Elliot's mind raced with thoughts of the future. What had they gotten themselves into? What would happen if they didn't make it out in time? The journey to the safe house felt like an eternity. Elliot sat in the back of the car, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of danger. The children were quiet in the back seat, their faces pressed against the windows as the city passed by in a blur. As the car finally turned down a darkened road, Elliot allowed himself a moment to breathe. They were safe for now, but the realization of what was happening hit him like a punch to the gut. His life had irrevocably changed in ways he hadn't even begun to understand. And the road ahead? He couldn't see it. But one thing was certain, the stakes were higher than ever. As the car drove deeper into the night, Elliot realized that this was only the beginning. The true fight was still ahead. The morning light filtered through the thick curtains, casting soft beams across the room. For a brief, precious moment, the house was still. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had transpired, the danger, the uncertainty, the fear. But as the sunlight illuminated the quiet, it also highlighted the subtle changes that had occurred in the days that followed. Elliot Moore stood by the window, staring out at the world he once thought he had conquered. His reflection seemed foreign to him now. The man who had once ruled boardrooms and dictated the flow of wealth and power now found himself in the midst of a new, more humbling battle. It wasn't the kind of war he had prepared for, but it was one that had irrevocably altered him. He had saved his children. His children. The thought still felt so foreign, so overwhelming that it brought a lump to his throat. 5 beautiful, vulnerable lives were now his responsibility. He had never thought he would be a father, certainly not in the way he had imagined. The life he had built with his own 2 hands, constructed meticulously from ambition, would have to be reshaped, redefined. And for the first time, Elliot felt something that had always eluded him, the need for connection. But the road to this realization had not been easy. It had been fraught with tension, fear, and confusion. The night of the breach, when the gang had come so dangerously close to the children, had been the moment Elliot truly understood the stakes. The danger was no longer abstract. It was real, it was immediate, and it was relentless. As the children slept soundly in the rooms upstairs, their breathing soft and steady, Elliot reflected on what they had been through, what he had been through. His instinct had always been to control, to manage, to direct. But now, nothing felt more important than showing up for these children. No spreadsheets, no mergers, no business deals could fill the void of not being there for the people who needed him most. And then there was Emma. He had never expected to be so drawn to someone like her, someone whose quiet strength had become such a force in his life. She had stood by him through all the confusion, the chaos, and the fear. She had given him the strength he didn't know he had. She had trusted him when he hadn't trusted himself. He could feel her presence in the room even though she wasn't there. It was like an invisible thread that connected them, binding them in the shared purpose of protecting these children. He didn't know what the future held for him, for them, for their newly formed family. But he was beginning to understand that whatever came next, they would face it together. Elliot turned away from the window, his eyes settling on the door to the living room. He had a decision to make, one that would determine the course of his life, one that would change everything. It wasn't about money, about success, about the things he had spent his entire life chasing. This was about something deeper, something more essential. This was about love. This was about trust. This was about being the man he had never thought he could be. Later that evening, after the children had finished their dinner and the house had once again settled into a peaceful rhythm, Elliot called Emma into the living room. She entered quietly, her expression calm but expectant. He could sense her concern, as though she had already begun to anticipate what he was about to say. "Emma," he began softly, his voice rough with the emotions he had been holding back. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next, about everything, about the life I thought I wanted. But now, I realize something. I've spent so long building walls around myself, thinking that I could control everything, that I could have everything I wanted. But what I didn't realize was that what I needed wasn't more success. What I needed was connection. What I needed was love. And what I need now is to be a father." Emma stood still, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for something. The silence between them seemed to stretch, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes with understanding. "Elliot," she said quietly, her voice filled with quiet strength. "You don't have to do it all at once. You're already doing so much. You're already here, showing up. That's what matters." Elliot's heart swelled at her words. He had always thought that success meant being perfect, that it meant being in control. But now he understood that the real victory wasn't in power or wealth. The real victory was in being present, in showing up, and in loving without expecting anything in return. "I want to be here for them," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I want to be here for you too, if you'll have me." Emma smiled softly, her eyes glistening with something deeper than affection. It was understanding, it was trust, and most of all, it was a quiet promise. "I've always believed in you, Elliot. I'm here. We're in this together." The weight of her words settled into him like a calm sea. In that moment, Elliot Moore finally understood that love was not something to be earned, not something to be controlled. It was something that was given freely, and it was something that could change everything. As the days passed, Elliot threw himself fully into this new life. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there were still many challenges ahead. The children would need time to heal, to adjust to the safety he could now provide. He would need time too to figure out what it meant to be their father, to be someone who didn't just give them what they wanted, but someone who gave them what they needed. The mansion that had once felt cold and sterile now felt like home. The laughter of children echoed through the halls, a sound that felt warmer with each passing day. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when Elliot questioned whether he was doing the right thing. But those moments were fleeting, swept away by the weight of his commitment. And through it all, Emma stood by him. She had shown him what it meant to be vulnerable, to be human. She had shown him that love was the most powerful thing in the world, and that it was enough. In the end, it wasn't the money, the power, or the success that defined Elliot Moore. It was the family he had unexpectedly built, a family that had healed him just as much as he had healed them, and with each passing day he found that what he had once believed to be the ultimate goal, success, was nothing compared to the joy of simply being present for those who needed him most. He had finally found his true purpose, and in doing so, he had become the man he had always needed to be, and that was enough. As Elliot stood in the quiet of the mansion, surrounded by the laughter of his children and the comforting presence of Emma, he realized he had finally found something he never thought he needed: connection. The life he had built on ambition and control had brought him success, but it was love, responsibility, and the courage to change that truly defined him now. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but Elliot had discovered something far more valuable than money or power. He had found his purpose. If you enjoyed this journey of transformation and resilience, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that show how the greatest challenges often lead to the most rewarding changes. Join us next time for another powerful tale, and remember, you never know when your life might change in ways you never expected.